Imagine a throne room, draped in silks and glittering with gold, holding its breath. For years, an entire empire has waited for this moment, the birth of a male heir, a king destined to rule over a global superpower. The Queen, Mariana of Austria, has finally delivered a son to her husband, King Philip IV of Spain. This should be a moment of absolute triumph. But as the physicians and midwives draw back the blankets, a chilling silence falls over the room. The celebration dies in their throats. The child they see is not the strong, healthy symbol of a dynasty's future they had prayed for. He is small, sickly, and marked by deformities that speak of a dark secret lurking in the royal bloodline. They didn't know it yet, but they were looking at the beginning of the end. This baby, Charles II, would become known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched, a living testament to a terrifying tradition that turned the most powerful families in the world into prisoners of their own blood. This is the story of how the quest for power, purity, and prestige led to the horror of royal inbreeding, creating kings who were too sick to rule and queens who birthed monsters. To understand how a king could be born so broken, you first have to understand the royal marriage game. For centuries, the monarchies of Europe weren't just families, they were corporations, and marriage was their most important business transaction. The goal wasn't love or happiness, it was power. A marriage could seal a peace treaty, acquire new territories, or solidify a shaky claim to a throne. And the best way to keep power and wealth within the family was simple: don't let it leave. This meant marrying your relatives. First cousins were common, but it didn't stop there. Uncles marrying nieces, aunts marrying nephews, these unions were not only accepted but encouraged. They were seen as a brilliant political strategy. It kept the bloodline pure, preventing foreign influence from seeping into the dynasty. The Habsburgs, the family that dominated Europe for over 600 years, were the undisputed masters of this game. They saw intermarriage as their greatest tool, a way to build a web of influence so tight that they effectively ruled most of the continent. What they failed to realize was that this web was slowly becoming a genetic cage. The House of Habsburg was a dynasty defined by one iconic feature: a prominent, jutting lower jaw. The Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathicism, was the family's signature, a physical stamp of their elite status. But it was also the first warning sign that something was deeply wrong. For generations, Habsburgs had been marrying Habsburgs. It was a closed loop. Spanish Habsburgs married Austrian Habsburgs. The family tree wasn't a branching tree at all. It was more like a tangled vine, folding back on itself again and again. Take, for example, the parents of Charles II. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was the daughter of Philip IV's sister. That means Philip IV married his own niece. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was standard procedure. Of the 11 marriages that occurred within the Spanish Habsburg dynasty over nearly 200 years, 9 were between close blood relatives. This relentless inbreeding concentrated the family's genetic material, both the good and the bad. And as the generations wore on, the bad began to dangerously outweigh the good. When Charles II was born in 1661, he was the culmination of this centuries-long genetic experiment. The hope of the Spanish Empire rested on his tiny shoulders. But from the moment he drew his first breath, it was clear he was profoundly unwell. His head was enormous and his body was frail. The infamous Habsburg jaw was so pronounced in him that his top and bottom rows of teeth could not meet. This meant he couldn't chew his food properly for his entire life, leading to constant digestive problems. He was unable to speak clearly until he was 4 and couldn't walk without assistance until he was nearly 8. As he grew, it became obvious that his issues were not just physical. He suffered from severe developmental delays, what we would today recognize as a significant intellectual disability. The Spanish court, steeped in superstition, couldn't explain his condition with science. They concluded he must be the victim of a curse, a victim of witchcraft. They called him the Bewitched and subjected him to countless exorcisms, hoping to drive out the demons they believed were tormenting their king. But the demon wasn't supernatural. It was in his DNA. The life of Charles II was a catalog of suffering. Beyond his inability to chew or speak properly, he was plagued by a host of illnesses. He was epileptic, suffering from violent seizures. He was frequently struck down by fevers, measles, chickenpox, and rubella, each one threatening to kill him. His body was a roadmap of genetic defects. But his greatest failure, in the eyes of the court, was his infertility. Despite 2 marriages, he was unable to produce an heir. Modern analysis suggests he may have suffered from a combination of genetic disorders, including pituitary hormone deficiency and distal renal tubular acidosis, which could have rendered him impotent and infertile. Imagine the pressure on this man, a king who carried the weight of a global empire but was physically and mentally incapable of ruling it, and biologically incapable of continuing its legacy. He was a king in name only, a puppet for court factions while his body and mind crumbled. So what exactly was happening on a biological level? It all comes down to recessive genes. We all carry thousands of them, genes for certain traits or diseases that usually remain hidden because we have a dominant, healthy gene from one parent to override it. However, when close relatives have children, the chances of both parents passing on the same harmful recessive gene to their child skyrocket. This is what happened to the Habsburgs. Scientists developed a metric called the inbreeding coefficient to measure the likelihood of inheriting 2 identical genes from a common ancestor. For the child of 2 first cousins, that coefficient is 6.25%. For Charles II, a product of generations of uncle-niece and cousin-cousin marriages, his inbreeding coefficient was a staggering 25.4%. To put that in perspective, the coefficient for a child born to a parent and their child, or a brother and his sister, is 25%. Genetically speaking, Charles II was as inbred as a person could possibly be. His body was a battleground of faulty genes, with no healthy copies to come to the rescue. The Habsburgs were the most extreme case, but they were far from the only ones. In the 19th century, another royal family spread a different genetic curse across Europe, the British royal family, under Queen Victoria. Victoria was a carrier for hemophilia, a rare genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly. A small cut or bruise could be a life-threatening event. Because Victoria's 9 children married into nearly every major royal house on the continent, she became known as the Grandmother of Europe, and she inadvertently spread this royal disease with them. Her granddaughter, Alex, became Empress Alexandra of Russia. She passed the gene to her only son, Tsarevich Alexei. The young heir's life was a constant struggle against pain and the threat of bleeding to death. His mother's desperation to cure him led her to the mystic Rasputin, a relationship that would contribute directly to the downfall of the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty and the Russian Revolution. The pursuit of a closed, interconnected royal network had, once again, sowed the seeds of its own destruction. This royal obsession with inbreeding wasn't just a European phenomenon. It was an ancient tradition, practiced by rulers who believed they were gods and couldn't possibly mix their divine blood with that of mortals. The most famous example comes from ancient Egypt. When archaeologists opened the tomb of King Tutankhamun, they found a young pharaoh who had died under mysterious circumstances. For decades, theories swirled about murder and intrigue. But in 2010, DNA analysis of his mummy revealed a much sadder truth. King Tut's parents were not just husband and wife, they were brother and sister. And like Charles II, Tutankhamun paid the price. The DNA tests showed he suffered from a host of genetic maladies. He had a clubfoot and a bone disease that would have forced him to walk with a cane, over 130 of which were found in his tomb. He also had malaria and a cleft palate. He was no powerful boy king. He was a frail, disabled ruler whose short life was likely defined by chronic pain, all because of his pure, divine bloodline. Back in Spain, the tragic life of Charles II was drawing to a close. At just 38 years old, he looked like an ancient man. An autopsy performed after his death in 1700 revealed a shocking state of decay. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, his intestines were gangrenous, and his head was full of water. The physician who examined his body reportedly wrote that it did not contain a single drop of blood. Most importantly, he died without an heir. His death triggered a crisis that his family's marriage strategy was supposed to prevent. With no direct successor, the other great powers of Europe, particularly France and Austria, saw an opportunity to place one of their own on the Spanish throne and claim its vast empire. The result was the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal, decade-long conflict that engulfed the continent and led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. The Habsburg dynasty, which had sacrificed the health of its children for the sake of power, had lost it all. The genetic time bomb they had built had finally exploded, and it took an entire empire down with it. The story of Charles II and the other victims of royal inbreeding is a horrifying cautionary tale. It's a story of how the relentless pursuit of power and the misguided belief in pure blood led directly to decay, disease, and destruction. These dynasties thought they were preserving their strength, but with every generation they were diluting it, writing their own extinction into their genetic code. They weren't cursed by witches or punished by the heavens. They were the architects of their own downfall, brought low by a foe they could never see, hidden deep within their own blood.
What part of this story did you find the most shocking? Was it the sheer extent of Charles II's suffering, or the fact that this practice continued for centuries despite the obvious consequences? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this dive into the dark side of history fascinating, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more stories you were never taught in school.
Don't forget to hit the notification bell and share this with anyone who loves a good historical mystery. Thanks for watching.